Hello class and welcome to my presentation on ecopedagogy. Ecopedagogy was the topic that I chose from the Critical Pedagogy Reader. It was actually chapter 27 titled Towards Ecopedagogy, Weaving a Broad-Based Pedagogy of Liberation for Animals, Nature, and the Oppressed People of the Earth. Now I understand that is quite a mouthful, so one more time, that is Towards Ecopedagogy, Weaving a Broad-Based Pedagogy of Liberation for Animals, Nature, and the Oppressed People of the Earth. So sit back, relax, and enjoy my presentation. Okay, so this should look familiar to everybody. This is the classroom. Now, what is interesting about ecopedagogy is that it's trying to move us from the reality of the classroom and to get students to think about the earth as a whole. So let's make that transition one more time. So here's where we start, and this is where we want our students to end up. Interesting. There's actually one more thing I'd like to consider before we get into some of the deeper points of ecopedagogy. Not only are we trying to move them from the classroom to the earth as a whole, but I would say that this is probably one of the greatest impediments to them making that transition. The fact that they view the world, right, with the lines and the horizontal and vertical through a smartphone. So we have this added challenge of breaking through the virtual to pull our students back to the physical. All right, so let's go ahead and just dive right into the information. So what is ecopedagogy? Okay, historically, ecopedagogy began in Latin America, in the Latin American educational context, growing out of discussions conducted at the Second Earth Summit held in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in 1992. In this movement, intellectuals desired to make systematic statements about the interrelationship between humanity and the earth, and to formulate a mission for education universally to integrate an ecological ethic. Yes, it's very, very dense. It's very, very complex. I know I'm using the word very. So, we're going to try to take a piece at a time to where we can take this highly academic jargon, in fact, ecopedagogy, and kind of break it down so that we can see how the application is really more simple than you might imagine just from a definition like this. So systematic statements, interrelationship, humanity. Let's move on. Okay, so in continuing to elaborate on this definition of ecopedagogy, specifically, the ecopedagogy movement is an outgrowth of developments in critical pedagogy. So by now everybody should be familiar with critical pedagogy in the sense of Paulo Freire, correct? And dealing with some of these more liberationist approaches to education that revert back to social justice, that are seeking to liberate humans, students, from the circumstances that enslave them. Now, obviously, liberating somebody from the circumstance that enslaves them also entails making them aware of the circumstances that enslave them, but we don't necessarily want to dive too deeply into that right now. So following Freire, the ecopedagogy mission is to develop a robust appreciation for the collective potential of human beings, right? As a whole, we're going to return to this idea consistently, moving away from the individual. It seems like we have so many critical approaches that deal with, oh, let's individual, community, society, culture, politics, economics. But what we're really trying to focus on is holistic methods. And I think ecopedagogy does a wonderful job of taking the individual's focus back to the whole, back to this larger concept, right? Okay, so let's continue. So the mission is to develop a robust appreciation for the collective potentials of being human and to foster social justice throughout the world. But it does so as part of a future-oriented, ecological, political vision that rapidly opposes the globalization of ideologies such as neoliberalism and imperialism on one hand, and attempts to foment forms of critical ecoliteracy on the other. Yes, I mean, I don't know about you, but as I was digging into this information, I was consistently confronted with challenging vocabulary that I just had to go back and globalization, neoliberalism, imperialism, okay, critical ecoliteracy, right? Interesting concepts in and of themselves, but what is it that ecopedagogy is trying to establish? All right, and it helps to think through these concepts through a critical lens, through a critical pedagogy lens. So, moving forward through this slide. Additionally, ecopedagogy has as one of its goals the realization of culturally relevant forms of knowledge. And I really, culturally relevant forms of knowledge, and that can be geographic too, not talking about this one culture, but the culture of different geographies, of different peoples. Um, and we're dealing with these three main concepts, which I think are just fascinating. So sustainability, right? We have to think of systems as sustainable, first and foremost. Planetarity. Planetarity. How many of you have heard of that word? Planetarity. Identifying yourself as an earthling, right? Kind of sounds a little science fiction-y, but I mean really and truly fascinating. And biophilia, right? Sounds a little dirty at first, but in reality, it's just the love of all life. Bio meaning life and philia, the love of. So biophilia. So let's go ahead and continue. Okay, three main questions. And obviously, we're not going to have the time to even give close to comprehensive answers for these questions, but let's at least start the conversation. So, how can we as citizens of the planet participate in the creation of a world that we want instead of simply observing those who are profiting off of extraction and exploitation create our world for us, right? Those who are profiting off of extraction and exploitation. And I mean, regardless of your political or economic or social stance, I think we can all agree that that is a few, right? And they're creating that world for us, and we just kind of sit by. So how do we break ourselves out of that? What does an education look like that can encourage people to face what is happening? This is a very stark reality. I think a lot of people don't want to face some of the things that I'm going to discuss later on in this presentation. So how do we encourage people to face what's happening, take responsibility for ourselves, and work to create healthy, vibrant, and resilient communities that serve everyone, no one excluded? It's not the same for all. I definitely don't feel that ecopedagogy is advocating that, but to work within the community that we are in and to appreciate the contributions of other communities and cultures. What kind of education is really relevant today, given our current globalized condition with the social and ecological crisis? Think about it. In answer to the question, why do we have to learn this? Sometimes the answer is you really don't. And when are we going to use this? If you really confront some of this knowledge, you would have to answer your students honestly and say, when are you going to have to use this? You won't. The danger here is that this knowledge has become inert. And ultimately, doesn't that make it an exercise in futility? So we really have to question what kind of education is relevant today, and that is just a can of worms that can lead you in all different types of directions. So we're going to try to remain focused, but these are the three guiding questions of this presentation that I would definitely like you to internalize and in your own way carry forward and figure out how you're going to deal with these challenges. And there's some source information. Okay, so issues. All right, so there we go. Globalization, first and foremost, a process of interaction and integration among the people, companies, and governments of different nations. A process driven by international trade and investment and aided by information technology. Okay, well that doesn't sound so bad. Well, thank you, Globalization 101. Neoliberalism. Was this like the liberalism and the conservatism of politics? Interestingly, with economics, it's the opposite. When you talk about liberal economic policy and conservative economic policy, it's an approach to economics and social studies in which control of economic factors is shifted from the public sector to the private sector. But who would have who would have thought about that, right? Because everybody's just so locked into those definitions when it comes to political and liberal. I'm sorry, conservative and liberal. Thank you, Investopedia. But now we get to it. Imperialism. Acquisition by a government of other governments or territories, or of economic or cultural power over other nations or territories, often by force. Colonialism is a form of imperialism. So now we're connecting globalization, neoliberalism, and imperialism all together. And if you just take a moment, you really start to see, what's going on? What's going on? This idea of what's sustainable? Are our practices sustainable? Transnational techno-capitalism. Try that one on for size. Okay, here's some other words for you to consider. Okay, colonialism, capitalism. Well, how do you really think about those words? Neo-colonialism, techno-capitalism. Interesting, interesting, interesting. Okay, so what's going on? How is ecopedagogy going to bring a new dimension to education? Really and truly, any claim that's moving towards social justice, universal human rights, or global peace must contend with the deteriorating ecological crisis at hand, okay? We have to confront that first and foremost. Any failure to integrate ecological sustainability at the core of our political and pedagogical struggles for liberation is ultimately doomed to failure. It's blindly and misguidedly, adhering to a very human-centered view of the world, and our dreams of freedom that deal with only human interests are not paying attention to to the health of the planet. And I think the basic equation here that you have to consider is organism plus environment. That's the basic ecological unit of survival. And it seems that all we focus on is organism, and that organism that we particularly focus on is the human, right? Agree to disagree, but there's some food for thought. Don't believe me? Just watch. Okay, so at this point in time, it would be difficult to deny that we are destroying our planet. It would. I would love to hear your argument, but it would be difficult to deny that we're destroying our planet. Clear cutting, strip mining, Arctic drilling, crop sterilization, acid rain, chemical spills, rapid extinction of species, raging wildfires, holes in the ozone layer, genetic engineering, global warming, biowarfare, and population explosion. Not to mention, if we just look out our own windows, extreme drought, smog. We have pushed nature to the threshold of catastrophe. And this isn't doom and gloom, but it's just to raise the question, how are we going to bring this into the classroom? What are we going to do with our students? And really and truly, I think one of the better articles that I read brought to light these three realities right here. There has to be an experiential, place-based, and hopeful pedagogy. Okay, this is what's going to help us take some of these very complex and oftentimes difficult to confront ideas and bring them into our classroom through experience, through grounding it in the place, in the classroom, in the community, and then also infusing that element of hope, right? Because there's no way to inspire and motivate people to action if they are not hopeful. They don't see a vision. If they don't see truth and power and advocacy in action, in wanting to step out of their comfort zone. So before I finish I finish part one and we move into part two, let's go ahead and just consider this quote really quick. And this was from a wonderful poem that I read in another article. So, teach the children. Show them daisies and the pale hepatica. Teach them the taste of sassafras and wintergreen, the lives of the blue sailors, mallow, sunburst, and moccasin flowers. And then my favorite, Give them the fields and the woods and the possibility.